You mentioned the West. In other words, the idea was that by allowing radical Islamists into the UK, it could become, or would become, or has become, a launching pad for those who want to destroy the West. So the question, of course, is, what is the West? And you deal with that a little bit in the book. So let's talk about that. Douglas Murray, of course, has written a book about the West. When we talk about the West, what do we mean?
Well, I don't mean the West in terms of geography, although it's generally considered to be, well, certainly the English-speaking world is considered the West. So, Australia and Canada are considered to be the West, even though they're not exactly contiguous. That's another big word, I'm afraid.
Actually, that's really not a big word, but thank you for insulting me. Go ahead.
To me, the West is an idea. The West is a civilization. It's a culture that developed, I think, it's not just Western civilization.
Yeah.
It is civilization. It's what we, those of us who are religious and a-religious understand to be civilized values, e.g., rule of law, a commitment to justice, fairness, compassion, putting others above yourself so that you have a cooperative sense of creating a community. Stuff like that. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality for women. These are kind of, we almost sort of don't think about these things. And, the fashionable view is that these things are universal values. Right. As if we were all born with them imprinted upon our DNA, or we got it all from the Greeks. Well, the ancient Greeks gave the West a great deal, but they didn't give it compassion and justice and democracy. On the contrary, it was a savage and very unpleasant and tyrannical society. So, I think that civilized values actually inhere in the West, and that they bind disparate societies together. So, the countries of mainland Europe, as I say, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America. These are the West because when we talk about the West, we have in our minds this culture that is a shared set of values and institutions, not institutions, because the institutions are all different, a shared set of values that come from a tradition that goes back it goes back a very long way. It goes back before America was created.
How dare you?
And it depends where you start as to where these values actually came from.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, the idea of the West, it's interesting, as you mentioned the values, the shared values of the West. Two things at least come into my mind. One is that not all of these values have always been Western values, that as time passes, of course, they become things that we sort of tease out and we say, yes, we need to have women's rights at some point. Obviously, we didn't have religious liberty until fairly recently, let's say 2.5 centuries, something like that. So that's one thing, that the evolution of what makes the West as we would define it.
Some of them are more recent than others.
Yeah, and which I think would lead us to try to figure out why is that. When we talk about the West and we define what is the West, I mean, if somebody asked me, I guess I would say Athens and Jerusalem. Being a Greek, of course, I'm a little bit partial, but I do think that somehow it's a combination of the two, but it's definitely something that has evolved, and that we are at a point now where we can look back and see this evolution of ideas. So talk a little bit about that, because it seems to me that that will lead us, I think, to talk about the self-destructive tendencies that exist within the West, which maybe we'll get to.
Well, when we think of the West, I think we think of modernity as almost a kind of synonym for the West. And when we think of modernity, well, I think most people would date modernity to start with the 18th century Enlightenment, which was a kind of watershed between medieval, Dark Age barbarism and the development of Enlightenment, by which we mean the Age of Reason, where religion was separated from the state, from power, and where tolerance developed, which set the scene for the development of the concern for the individual, which again set the scene for the development of learning and science and all those things that make the West. Because we think of modernity, we think of science, and we think of technological whiz-bangery and all the rest of it. Now, if you start at the Enlightenment, well, it wasn't very enlightened, actually, because it was and it wasn't. It did great things, It put an end to certain savageries of the past, although I think the Dark Ages weren't necessarily quite as dark as people make out, but that's another matter. So the Enlightenment produced, a move towards the things that we kind of, as I say, take for granted, like tolerance and so on. But in the Enlightenment were the seeds of its own downfall, of the downfall of Western tolerance and liberalism. Because some people call it the counter-enlightenment, but it was the kind of swirl of ideas that came from that period, which I think led to certain unfortunate developments. Gertrude Himmelfarb, who wrote about all this kind of stuff, in my view a great historian, divided the Enlightenment into at least two, possibly three. And she said, there was the British Enlightenment and the European Enlightenment, mainly the French Enlightenment, and they were very, very different. The British Enlightenment was conceived of the development of the separation of church and state and the development of tolerance within the ambit of Christian faith. That was considered to be the sine qua non. It was just considered to be absolutely the given, that was the basis for the moral basis for a society. And then within that, you develop tolerance and all the rest of it. The French wanted to get rid of religion completely. They believed that religion was the impediment to reason and happiness. And I think it's possible to trace that line as having produced all the problems that we have today. And there are some people who think that the British Enlightenment actually had the seeds of that also, but certainly the French Enlightenment, you can draw a line, I would say, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is my candidate for supreme villain of all time. He was, of course, insane, but nevertheless, he had tremendous influence on the idea that, authority was an encroachment on personal autonomy.
Yeah.
And what was inside you, what was inside the child,
Yeah.
Was what was real and true, and everything else has to be sort of got rid of. And from that, I'm obviously encapsulating rather a lot into a very short number of words, but basically you can see a line from that through the French Revolution, which was supposed to be the age of reason and freedom and ended up in the terror, and then from that through to Marxism and fascism, and what I consider that we have been living through, which is not my term, but cultural totalitarianism. And at the heart of it was basically the idea that religion was the impediment to progress and freedom. And that, I think, is the central point, and that's the central point of my book, that, especially in godless Britain, because Britain, as I like to think of it, Britain was like first into the Enlightenment and first out. Britain is really a post-religious society in a way that America is not, although it's encroaching, but it's different. And so much of what we've been living through is the result of secular ideologies replacing the idea of objective truths which are basically given to us in the Bible. And it's absolutely axiomatic in Britain that if you are a smart person, if you're educated, and you're sophisticated, then of course you're not religious, because only imbeciles are religious. And I'm afraid that's the seeds of the destruction of what such secular liberals hold dear.
Yeah, well, of course, what you've said is true of Manhattan, where we are now. And I could say in some ways that's the reason we started Socrates in the City. You've said so much there that's interesting. I don't want to skip past it. When you refer to Rousseau and the French Enlightenment, it seems that when we're talking about religion, let's say, because this is a difficult term in some ways, we have to discuss what we mean by that. And I think what Tocqueville saw, of course, in the United States of America, he thought, my goodness, religion flourishes with liberty. Somehow the two are working together. And of course, that has to do with the fact that, at least in France, the church was somehow a powerful institution rather than...
Yeah, and it was oppressive.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me that they took the wrong tack because of that. They rejected it altogether.
Well, they threw the baby out with the bathwater, basically.
Did you just invent that term? That's very good.
Alas.
So
I can't claim credit for it.
But
it was probably yourself who invented it. I probably was reading something you wrote.
Probably. I have to say, I've coined many cliches, so I'm sure. But it's so fascinating to me to go back to Rousseau, to think of that it's that far back that things went wobbly, I guess, as you would say. And so when we're talking about the West, let's just go back here. At what point does the West become the West? I mean, when we're thinking of medieval Christendom, for example, I would say that's the West. It's not the West that we know today. Or would you draw a line at the Enlightenment?
When I think of medieval Christendom, I don't think of the West, I think of Europe. I just think of it like that.
What's the difference between the West and Europe?
Well, because the West is bigger than Europe. The West is a set of ideas which I suppose I am equating the West with modernity, really. Geographically, of course, Europe was the West. So, it hasn't moved. Well, I mean, a bit broke off, and that's called Great Britain. And it kind of floated off into the Atlantic and then got stuck.
Yeah.
Okay. But apart from that, I mean, one doesn't talk about when one's talking about medieval society. Well, I mean, perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't think people write about the West, because the West is bigger. It incorporates, I say, the entire English-speaking world for a start. But
you know that there once were no English-speaking people in Australia.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So
the West has expanded, but I mean the seed of the West.
Yeah, but medieval Europe, medieval Christendom. Does one think about when one thinks about the Inquisition, which I do quite often. Does one think, well, that was a Western thing? No, one thinks it's a European thing.
This gets to the heart of it, is that within the West, there are, you could say, generously anomalies, or you could say contradictions. In other words, even as the West progresses, you keep seeing retrograde motion. I mean, it's not a consistent development. So, because you cannot really draw a line from, the nation of Israel, 1000 BC, all the way through. You have to pass through medieval Christendom with all of its huge problems. But nonetheless, that legacy was transmitted through Western Europe.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's say. Let's talk about some of that, because when we're talking about the West, I know you say it a lot in the book, and it's in the title, of course. You're saying that at the heart of the West is what exactly? The biblical ideas that we get from Israel?
I I'm saying that at the heart of the values that we in the West consider to be civilized, which we associate with modernity and liberalism in its old-fashioned sense, things like tolerance and freedom and democracy and rule of law and all those sorts of things, at the heart of all those good things that we all value, whether we're religious or not religious, are biblical values which were instituted throughout the West through Christianity, which is the foundational creed of what we now talk about as the West or modernity. But Christianity came from Judaism, and the values that, Christianity produced certain principles or precepts which are embedded in the West and Western culture. But I would suggest that the core things that made the West great, moral, and civilized came from the Hebrew Bible, which were translated into the West through Christianity. People don't like, especially in Britain, they don't like to think about Christianity as having had any role in anything good in the West. Anything good in the West
Where do they imagine that any of this good stuff came from? From the brow of
They think it's universal.
Zeus?
Yes, no, from our own DNA.
Okay, so this gets back to Rousseau. In other words, what they believe, and what all utopianists believe, is simultaneously in the perfection or the perfectibility of man.
Quite so.
And in the fundamental innocence of man. I mean, Rousseau would say that this idea that we don't have what Christians would call original sin, anything that needs attention, that if you let a child develop untrammeled by any kind of authority or rules, that's kind of what you're looking for.
Well, the interesting thing is that the ideologies that have largely been introduced to replace religion in the West are all kind of horrible, perverted, warped ideas of a Christian idea of sin, redemption, and perfection. All of them. The West itself, it's founded, according to this kind of doctrine, in the original sins of colonialism and imperialism and whiteness, and it has to redeem itself by transforming itself into something completely redemptive, which is a brave new world of universalism and the brotherhood of man. Environmentalism is based on the idea that that the sin is modernity, it's industrialization, it's science, technology, and that has to be redeemed by basically, going back to the Holston cart, and then the planet will be saved. It's all sin, guilt, and redemption. And it's very interesting to me because it seems to me that a world that has basically said religion is bunk, we have to get rid of it to make a better world. Nevertheless, it hasn't got rid of it, it's just secularized it. Right. And the course of secularizing has turned it upside down.
Yeah.
Because it's got rid of the ideas of objective truth and goodness that are at the heart of the Bible.
Well, there are so many ways that ideology goes wrong, but it's fascinating to me that there are people, who would define the West in that secular way and not see the contradiction. I mean, the idea, why would one assume that out of our DNA would become would arise any of these wonderful values, and what makes them wonderful?
Well, I agree, I've never heard a convincing argument about this. I've never heard any argument about this. It's just a sort of statement. It's just like a belief. There's never a discussion because the kind of people who say this don't want to have a discussion.
If you think these conversations are valuable, would you do us a favor and please like this video and subscribe to this channel? When you do that, you help us get these conversations out to a wider audience by telling YouTube that people are interested in this. Also, you can go to SocratesInTheCity.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you can check back every week. There's new stuff here every week. Thank you for tuning in.